All right, just got done doing the video on looking at crossbows, modern crossbows, adjusting them for inflation compared to the OB, the original Bunjie, right? The crossbow that cost me $550 back in 2010. Let's look at modern crossbows, shall we? And specifically, let's look at a modern Excalibur. This is a crossbow that I'm very interested in. I was excited when they announced it. I'm excited to do a video on it. There's some good and bad things I like, things I don't like about this crossbow, this new offering from Excalibur. Let's take a look. Start by going to crossbows. The first thing we notice is the RevX is listed under the Assassin series. That tells me that this is considered an Assassin. Now that's likely because it has a built-in crank, which we'll see. It's like the new flagship offering from the company, okay? Another thing we notice about Excalibur here, the dual fire series is a series of one crossbow, right? There's only one, and that is the TAC-2, the Twin Strike. So that's been out for a couple of years. Excalibur has not offered another one. There's only one on there. I don't know what the future of this series is. To me, it was a novelty. I don't think that was really something people want. Wouldn't be surprised if we see that dropped. Once they run out of parts, it'll quietly go away, perhaps. The Micro series, right? That's our smaller limbs. The Mag series, these are also the smaller limbs. If we look here, now the Assassin 420, that is the only remaining takedown variety of crossbow. That's something apparently Excalibur offered that didn't take, and they're just taking it down. No pun intended. The Assassin Extreme, this one, when we look at these, we've talked about this before, talked about this last year, but the only extreme thing about this is the lack of a paint job. One thing I will say about this new one we're looking at, this looks a little wonky, doesn't it? Doesn't it look like kind of old, the stock, the built-in crank, it just has an older look to it. And if we look at that stock, it looks even more outdated, doesn't it? Doesn't it look real blocky and clunky looking, to the extent that looks matter. But this was their flagship crossbow. Now we have the RevX. We're going to take a peek at that. Kaboom. This crossbow, now one of the things, the first thing we see is a more sleek, more modern design for that crank. It doesn't take up the whole back end of the stock. It's been incorporated into the stock to look more like the other modern Excalibur offerings. And when we talk about modern updates, the handle actually snaps right in here, the handle to the crank. Now our crank is right here, but that handle snaps right in here, it snaps in place, snaps in and out. So it's not going to fall out, you're not going to lose it. And from what I've seen of people operating this crossbow, what little there is online, it's very easy to get the handle in and out, stores right there out of the way, real good. I do like this design. I like the pistol grips. I really do like that from Excalibur. It just does look a little bit more modern in terms of the design. Originally, Excalibur came out with the C2 crank. That was their first crank, and that thing, no. That's no good. Then they came out with the Charger EXT, a Charger Lite. This is an incorporated version in the crossbow using that same system, I guess. We have the Advanced Charger X integrated crank. That cranking system, right, that we see here right here with that crank is quiet, and if you let go of the handle, it stops. And you can decock it at any point. The other thing about this crossbow, when you're cocking it, the entire trigger mechanism right here, that housing, will slide down the rail. The arrow wouldn't be there, but it would slide down the rail, grab the string, and then you crank it back. And if you change your mind, you can uncrank it. You're going to crank that whole housing back and hold the string in place. Not a big fan of that, but just in my head, it always kind of seemed like, why are we moving the trigger mechanism? That just seems risky to me. But by all accounts, it's working, right? So, and it's a good system, and it's working, and they're continuing to operate them that way. And it's a system that we're seeing on other crossbows, aren't we? We're seeing that with the 10-point, right? When I shot the 10.505 last summer, that crossbow had the same sort of setup. And I love that cranking system. I thought that was great. If you're going to crank a crossbow, that's a good way to do it. The handle on the Charger EXT is not going to fit this crossbow. It has its own size. We don't have the adjustability in the length. We don't have an adjustable cheek piece, I don't believe. Something that you might have had on other crossbows, at least the length on the Assassins was adjustable, but it doesn't appear to be the case anymore. But this is a design, the stock design and grip design and shouldering design. All of that is stuff that I think people who are using Excaliburs really like. So I think we're in good shape there. One other thing that we can see on this crossbow that I think is very important to note, you can't rope cock it. Check this out. There is no groove there to rope cock this crossbow. And that tells me the future of Excalibur crossbows is such that we are using cranks not ropes. I suspect that's because in order to get the speed out of this thing, they up that draw weight like nobody's business, right? And when I say nobody's business, it means it's none of your business and it's none of my business. And we aren't allowed to know what that draw weight is. That's what that tells me. When we look at this, traditionally your Excalibur crossbows had a little groove right here where the rope could ride. And now they've made this sort of horizontal in nature and not vertical. So you can't even put a groove in here. You cannot use a rope cocker on this crossbow. It is not designed for one. Top-down view. They don't show us any uncocked views. I don't know why, but no manufacturer really does that. Maybe it's because they want it to be an action picture that suggests action, like it's ready to shoot. I don't know. Maybe they're trying to hide how it really looks almost all of the time. The width of that crossbow, almost all of the time. They just don't want us to see that. But that's a very important thing to me. So we are looking at 25-inch wide, high output express limbs. I think the idea behind it was you can get the same speeds without upping the draw weight quite as much with these high output express limbs. However, the draw weight on this, they don't even tell us what it is, but I suspect it is very high. $1,600 for this crossbow. That's pretty much the price of a modern, high-end crossbow. That's where they start. I think all your scorpions are kind of in that range. When we look at some of the missions are in that range. You can get ravens in that range now. There's plenty of 10 points and Wicked Ridge in that range. That is kind of a modern price for crossbows. Go back and look at the other video that I just did to see what that means. Premium clean breaking trigger that delivers precise, consistent accuracy like no other. I like the Excalibur triggers that I've used over the years. However, they were for a while using a two-stage trigger, I think, and I don't like two-stage triggers. That's not something that I'm interested in. Other people might like those. I don't think that this is one, however, but this is a new trigger offering from that company. Let's look at the specs. 400 feet per second. Now, I've said this before, but 400 feet per second achieved with a 350 grain arrow. That is not a modern hunting weight for a crossbow, in my opinion. I'd like to see something around 450, but at least get the speeds with a 400-ish arrow. So we're not going to get 400 at 400 out of this Excalibur, but we're going to get close. And Excalibur has a reputation of being very true to their speeds. There's no problem with that. It's just that 350 grain arrow is not, that's the only part that I question. If we put a 400 on there, we're probably, maybe 380s. And if we put the 450 on there, we're probably below that. We could do some math, but really until you shoot them, every crossbow is going to handle weight a little bit differently. 7 to 9 pounds. So the 9 pounds with all the rubber and with all the scope installed and all that good stuff. You put a Burris Oracle X on there, it's going to jack it up to about 9.5 probably. Integrated crank. Talked about that, really do like it. Now, as low as 12 pounds of draw effort. Excalibur and other manufacturers have dropped a discussion. Many of the manufacturers have dropped the discussion about the actual draw weight because they don't want us to know, because it's kind of embarrassing. I suspect the draw weight of this crossbow is well over 300 pounds. It's probably more like 320, 325, something like that. And the reason I say that is the draw effort is 16 pounds. Now, Excalibur is telling us here as little as 12 pounds of draw effort. I think that applies with the Charger EXT crank on something like the Micro 360 series, somewhere around in there. That's your 12 pounds of effort, or maybe even the Mag 340. This one is 16 pounds, which is about the highest I've seen on a crank. 16 pounds is an awful lot for the crank because you've got gear reduction in there, right? It's like a bicycle almost. This isn't the 50% reduction that we're used to with the rope cocking device, for example. This is a mechanical reduction beyond that down to 16 pounds, but they don't tell us the draw weight. Overall length, 33 inches, considerably shorter, 4.5 inches shorter than the OB, the original Axiom there, the original Bunjie. Colors, they just give us the camo. Nothing wrong with that. It's a nice camo package. I like mossy oak. Yeah, whatever. Tech. These, let's see what we got here. The RevX Tech. And we click on these. That's the integrated crank we talked about. We have the Ceasefire anti-dry fire. Very nice to have anti-dry fire on your crossbow. I'm a dry fire expert. Premium trigger. Smooth, crisp travel, turning your crossbow into an extension of you with effortless control and accuracy. Doesn't say whether it's two-stage. If anybody knows, please chime in the comments. I'd like to know. That would make a difference to me. High output express limbs that they are now putting on all the micros, and it's a different setup. They're thicker, they're heavier. They've gone through a bunch of different changes over the years from the original ones that came on Genevieve's crossbow, Bunjie Jr., a micro suppressor 355. The original limb setup on that, those limbs broke, or one of them broke, and then we replaced them, had to buy some new limbs. Those came with different hardware, so we have a difference in terms of the mounting, the way they're mounted to the riser. They've came out with the thicker limb tips, and now the high output express, it's a different way of making the limbs. The limbs are a little bit heavier and thicker and stronger, that sort of thing. So that's all good. The red suppressors, those are these things right here, stop the string. And then we have a sound deadening system, which is a 4-component dampening system. And I suspect that means we've got 2 of the reds, and then we've got these rubber things, the X shocks or whatever, on the limbs too. Coming from the manufacturer, those might stay on, but I really don't like those things. If I had this crossbow, 100%, I would get rid of these little string stars they have in there. Did you see those? I really don't like those. I had a bad experience with those. I will not use those on a crossbow ever. And we can really see them in this picture, these string stars. First thing I would do if I had this crossbow is I would remove those and get rid of them and throw them away and never talk of them again. And then probably I would take off all the rest of this rubber and get rid of it. And then I would jack my arrow weight up to about 600 grains. And then I would have basically the same effect of all this rubber. What this rubber does is it slows the crossbow down. That's all it does. It puts more weight on the string and more weight on the limbs to slow the crossbow down. And that's all it does. You can do that with a heavier arrow, but you get a payoff for the heavier arrow. You get more penetration and more energy in that arrow. And you still reduce the vibration just as well as the rubber, except you have more energy downrange. That's the important thing. So I would do that. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm telling you to consider that. Think about that. Do your research. And I'm just telling you what I would do. So you can do whatever you want, but I would do that. And probably these would stay. I don't have a problem with these. If the brace height is proper, these things are fine. I really don't have a problem with those. We do have the integrated crank. That's a really good picture of the crank. And you can see right here, this is where the handle snaps in place. That's pretty cool. Overwatch illuminated scope. Overwatch is their new high-end scope. By all accounts, that's a good scope. I don't have a problem with that. I would replace it with a Burris Oracle X because I'm hooked on those. That's just my thing. Sound deadening system, red suppressors, 3-bolt quiver, 4 Proflight arrows, 4 100 grain field points. This is a sticking point for me, and I don't know why Excalibur continues to do this. They sell everything with a 350 grain arrow setup. They sell it that way. And in my opinion, it is totally inadequate for that crossbow. You can't have a really high draw weight of 325 pounds and sell everybody 350 grain arrows and act like that's okay. To me, that's not okay. They should come with 500 grain arrows, right? Like I'm shooting 500 grains out of the Enforcer, 500 grain arrows. And it just worked out that way because I got heavier inserts on the front end. I got the 150 grain broadhead. I've got the Burt Coyote Luminox on here. When you add all that up, it's about 499, 500 grains. 350 grains is just not appropriate for, especially for a crossbow like this. So that concerns me. Really, the only reason they're selling it with the 350 is so that they can pretend that this crossbow shoots 400 feet per second. That's the only reason they're doing it, is to up that speed. But they're kind of artificially, almost recklessly upping that speed because it's not going to be good for that crossbow, I don't think. And it also doesn't give you the energy downrange that I would think that this crossbow deserves to give you, wants to give you. This is a question I have. I have not seen an answer on this yet. By the time you see this, maybe there's a really good answer on this. But this crossbow has a new anti-dry fire system. And I'm wondering if because of that, if you have to use the Rhino Nox. This is a good example of them. And you can see in this picture, they have a little groove in them that tells the crossbow when you set that arrow in place, that little ball bearing or something sits in that groove and holds the arrow in place. And that operates the anti-dry fire system, and it won't fire without that ball bearing thinking that it's holding that arrow in place. That way, if your arrow inches forward a little bit, you don't get a partial dry fire. It doesn't trick the dry fire. You pull the trigger, but there's a gap between the string and the arrow, and you get a partial dry fire. It's a good system. I like it, but I don't like having to change Nox. And I don't want to use anything other than my Burt Coyote Luminox. I love those. I've been using them now for going on 15 seasons, and I'm not going to switch. So this might be a perfectly good knock. However, you can't replace the battery either. So it's got a built-in switch in it. So it's becoming more complicated. I like simpler, not more complicated. I don't want to change out all my nocks. I don't want to switch from my Burt Coyote Luminox, and I'm wondering if this crossbow would work with Burt Coyote Luminox. I can tell you that based on what I'm seeing here, this one I really like. I don't like cranks, you know that, but I accept the fact that someday to shoot modern speeds, I'm going to have a crank. I know that when I go to 450 feet per second or 500 feet per second, I'm going to have to use a crank, most likely. I don't think we're there yet. And I'm happy to rope cock the Enforcer. This crossbow, I can see this crossbow being a good crossbow for me too. And I do think that it's a step in the right direction in a lot of ways for Excalibur, but they've got to get past this idea that 350 grains is acceptable to advertise your crossbow with. I'd like to see all the manufacturers start giving me their speeds. What's it shoot with a 400 grain arrow? Jack the arrow weight up, you're over 350 feet per second most likely with a really good heavy arrow and broadhead combination. $1,600. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think of this guy? And until next time, all hail Bunjie.